The night was heavy with the weight of silence, broken only by the low crackle of a fire burning outside a weathered log cabin. The stars stretched endless above the desert plain, cold and silver, casting long shadows across the village that clung to life at the edge of the frontier. It was the late 1800s, a time when dust and danger lingered in every breath, when men carried both pride and fear in their holsters, and when the clash between settlers and native tribes painted the land with sorrow and survival. Out here, nothing came easy, and nothing lasted forever. She sat near the fire, her eyes reflecting both defiance and fear. Her clothes were made of deerskin, worn and torn, yet each stitch told of a heritage older than the cabins and fences that now rose across her people's hunting grounds. Her dark hair tumbled freely over her shoulders, a wild contrast to the rigid order of the village around her. Though she was young, the sharpness in her gaze revealed she had seen more suffering than most women twice her age. Her people called her a spirit child, for she moved quietly, speaking little, but her presence carried a weight that stirred those who noticed her. Tonight, however, she was not just another figure in the shadows. She was the center of a bargain that no one spoke of openly, but everyone felt lingering in the air. Across from her knelt the stranger, a man with dust on his boots and the look of someone who had ridden farther than most dared to. His broad frame bore the strength of survival. His hands, rough and scarred, rested on his knees as though he carried the memory of battles fought both within and without. His hat shaded his eyes, but every now and then the firelight caught his gaze, and in that glimmer lay a strange softness, a hesitation that did not belong to the hardened life he lived. He had been many things: cowboy, wanderer, fighter, perhaps even outlaw, depending on who told the story. But tonight, here in this village, he was something else. A man at the edge of a choice that could bind him forever. The settlement itself lay quiet behind them, the wooden structure standing crooked against the night wind. It was the kind of village that had grown out of desperation, a place built by those who had run from one life and sought another. Men drank hard, women worked harder, and children learned too soon that innocence had no place in the dust of the frontier. Horses whinnied softly from the corral, their silhouettes black against the firelit sky. Yet for all the stillness, an unspoken tension wove through the air. As though the land itself was holding its breath, she turned to him then, her voice barely a whisper, carrying more weight than if she had shouted. "If I please you tonight," she said, her words trembling between courage and fear, "will you keep me forever?" It was not a question made of romance or soft dreams. It was survival. It was the cry of a girl caught between a vanishing world and the harsh demands of another. Her people had been driven from their lands, hunted, traded, forced into bargains no one should ever have to make. To her, forever did not mean fairy tales, it meant safety. Protection from the storms both seen and unseen. The man did not answer right away. He studied her, the flickering flames carving shadows across his face. He thought of the trail that had led him here at the raids. The gun smoke, the empty bottles, the lonely nights beneath stars that offered no comfort. He had seen women sold to men with cold eyes, had heard promises made and broken like glass, and he knew what the world could do to someone who placed trust in the wrong hands. His heart stirred with something unfamiliar, something he had not felt since before the wars, before the long rides that had stripped him of hope. Was it pity? Was it desire? Or was it the recognition of a soul as lost as his own? The fire crackled louder, a log collapsing into glowing embers. For a moment, the only sound was the desert wind brushing across the empty land. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, long and mournful, as if echoing the girl's question. Her hands rested on her knees, her back straight, her jaw firm. But her eyes gave away the truth. She feared rejection more than she feared anything else in that moment. If he turned her away, where would she go? If he accepted her words, what would that mean for either of them? He reached for his canteen, took a long drink, and wiped the dust from his lips. Then he leaned closer, his voice low, rough like gravel but steady. "Forever is a long time," he said, each word falling heavy. She did not flinch. Instead, she held his gaze, as though daring him to look away. In her world, forever could be broken in a single sunrise, but she needed him to believe in it, even for a little while. He felt the weight of her unspoken plea settle in his chest, heavier than any rifle he had ever carried. Behind them, the door of the cabin creaked, and for an instant, both of them turned their heads. A shadow shifted inside, though no figure emerged. The village had eyes everywhere, watching, judging, whispering. Whatever happened tonight would not stay hidden for long. Choices here rippled like stones thrown into still water, and sooner or later, every ripple reached the shore. The girl's words had set something in motion, something neither of them could stop now. He looked back at her, the firelight dancing in her hair, and wondered if destiny had cornered him at last. Was she offering him salvation, or chaining him to a future he could not escape? The desert wind rose, swirling dust around them, and he knew the night was not done with its secrets. And then, before he could speak again, a sound cut through the silence, a distant hoofbeat, faint but steady, carrying closer with every heartbeat. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting once more. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the dark as the sound grew louder, echoing against the hard earth. Someone was coming. Someone who might not want her words to be answered. Someone who might change everything before the night was through. The man's hand hovered near his holster. The girl's breath caught in her throat, and the question she had whispered still hung in the air and answered unresolved, waiting for the next moment to decide their fate. The hoofbeats grew louder, carrying with them a sense of unease that pressed against the fire's glow. The man shifted slightly, his hands still hovering near his holster. The girl did not move, but her eyes darted toward the darkness beyond the flames. Out here in the frontier, an unexpected rider at night could mean anything: traitor, drifter, outlaw, or worse. Every soul who lived in the late 1800s, American village knew that danger traveled on horseback just as often as salvation did. The rider slowed as he neared the fire. The creak of saddle leather and the snort of a tired horse broke the stillness. A figure appeared from the dark, tall and lean, wrapped in dust-stained clothes. He said nothing at first, letting the horse settle as he studied the two by the fire. The stranger, by the flames, tipped his hat back, narrowing his eyes. The girl pulled the fringe of her deerskin dress closer, as though it could shield her from the weight of another set of eyes. Long way from town to be riding at this hour, the cowboy muttered, his voice steady, though the suspicion beneath it was clear. The rider dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He gave a slow nod, his face unreadable in the half-light. "The desert don't sleep," he said, his tone low, almost tired. "Neither do the men hunting across it." His words seemed to settle like dust in the air, heavy and warning. The girl's eyes widened, though she quickly lowered them. The man by the fire caught the flicker of fear she tried to hide. Something was pressing closer to this village than anyone wanted to admit. Trouble had a way of finding small places like this, the kind of trouble born of land disputes, old grudges, and promises broken between settlers and tribes. The cowboy gestured to the fire. "You're welcome to sit," he said. But the courtesy came edged with caution. The rider tied his horse to a post and sat near the flames, though not too close. His eyes kept shifting toward the girl, curiosity behind them, and the cowboy noticed. He stiffened slightly, a protective instinct stirring in him, though he could not yet explain why. The fire crackled on, the three of them bound together by silence. At last, the rider spoke again. "I've heard whispers of raids, men moving through the valley at night. Folks say they've seen smoke on the ridges, signs of something stirring. And here I find the two of you alone, as if waiting for it." The cowboy frowned, his jaw tightening. "We're not waiting for anyone." But even as he said it, the girl's words from earlier pressed into his mind again. "If I please you tonight, will you keep me forever?" She had asked as if she knew that forever could be stolen away in a single night. Perhaps she already sensed the storm coming. The rider gave a short, humorless laugh. "Nobody waits for trouble, but it don't matter, it always comes." He leaned back, the firelight painting sharp lines on his face. The girl finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Who are they?" she asked. Her words carried more weight than the cowboy expected, as if she already knew the answer would not be good. The rider looked at her for a long moment before replying. "Men who take what they want." Land, horses, people. His eyes lingered on her before shifting back to the flames. The cowboy's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't like the way the rider said it, didn't like the way he looked at her either. Tension stretched between them. But the girl rose suddenly and stepped away from the fire. She moved toward the cabin, her shadow long against the ground. The cowboy wanted to call after her, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he watched her disappear into the doorway. Leaving him with the stranger in the fire's restless crackle, the rider leaned forward. That girl. She's not from this village, is she? The cowboy stayed silent. Out here, words could become chains if spoken too freely. But his silence was enough. The rider smirked faintly, though it did not reach his eyes. Didn't think so. She carries the weight of the old tribes. Apache, maybe? You can see it in her eyes. She don't belong here. Yet here she is, bound by something neither of you will admit. The cowboy's gaze hardened. But before he could respond, the night wind picked up, carrying with it faint echo sounds of horses far off, moving in rhythm. The rider heard it too and stood quickly. They're closer than I thought. His hand went to his saddlebag, pulling out a rifle. If you've got sense, you'll be ready. The cowboy rose, his instincts sharp. The girl appeared again in the doorway, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She looked at both men, then toward the darkness, her face pale in the firelight. They're coming, aren't they? She whispered. Neither man answered, but the truth was written in the sound of hooves drawing near. The girl stepped closer to the cowboy, her eyes searching his. He felt the weight of her question from before return, heavier than ever. Will you keep me forever? It was no longer a ply it was a demand of fate. The rider shouldered his rifle and glanced toward the open land. Whatever choice you think you've got, it's about to be taken from you, he said grimly. Men like the ones coming don't ask. They take, and if she stays here unclaimed, she'll be the first they take. The cowboy's stomach knotted, though his face stayed firm. The girl's hand brushed his arm, a touch so small, yet filled with trust he didn't know if he deserved. The fire roared higher as the desert wind fanned it, sparks flying into the night sky. The hoofbeats grew louder, joined now by the faint metallic clatter of weapons. The village behind them stirred. Doors creaked open, voices whispered, and shadows gathered at windows. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew that before the night was over. This small settlement on the edge of the frontier would no longer be the same. The cowboy pulled his revolver from its holster. Spinning the chamber with a practiced flick, he looked once more at the girl, then at the rider. The stranger's rifle gleamed in the firelight. Both men nodded, though unease lay heavy in their eyes. The sound was almost upon them now, men on horseback, many of them riding fast. The girl stepped even closer to the cowboy, her whisper barely audible over the thunder of hooves. You promised me nothing yet, she said, her words trembling. But if you don't choose now, I will be lost. Her words pierced him deeper than any bullet could. He opened his mouth to answer, but the ground shook beneath them, and the riders burst from the darkness. Figures clad in dust and shadow stormed toward the village, their cries sharp against the night. The firelight caught the glint of rifles and blades, the wild eyes of horses, and the fury of men who had come to claim what they wanted. The cowboy raised his gun. The rider leveled his rifle. The girl's hand clutched at his sleeve, her breath quick, her eyes wide. And as the rider swept down, the question of forever hung suspended in the air, waiting for a choice that had not yet been made. The riders thundered into the village. It's like a storm breaking loose from the mountains. Dust rising in a choking cloud around the fire. Horses screamed and hooves split the earth, carrying men whose faces were hidden beneath wide hats and scarves. The firelight caught their weapons, rifles and pistols flashing like teeth in the dark. The cowboy steadied himself. His revolver gripped tight, the girl pressed against his arm. The rider beside him raised his rifle, the barrel catching the glow of the flames. For a brief moment, the three of them stood together as the village shifted into chaos. Doors slammed, windows shuttered, dogs barked, and children were pulled inside by desperate hands. The calm of the evening was gone, replaced by fear that spread like wildfire. The first of the intruders slowed their horses. circling the fire as if testing the strength of the two men standing there. Dust swirled around them, choking the air. One of the riders called out, his voice loud and commanding, "We've come for what belongs to us. Hand her over and nobody else needs to bleed tonight." His eyes cut toward the girl. And the cowboy felt her grip tighten on his sleeve. The cowboy's jaw locked, his silence an answer in itself. He had lived long enough to know that once you gave something up to men like this, they would never stop coming back for more. The rider at his side shifted his weight, his finger resting near the trigger, but he didn't fire. Not yet. The girl stood frozen, her eyes darting between the faces, circling them. She had seen this kind of hunger before, the same hunger that had torn her people's land from beneath their feet. She knew that she was at the heart of it, that these men would burn the whole village down if it meant taking her. Yet for all her fear, there was a spark of defiance in her gaze, quiet strength that no one could strip away. The cowboy stepped forward, planting himself firmly between her and the riders. "She doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice low, but carrying. The words cut into the tension like a blade. A harsh laugh rang out from one of the riders. "She don't belong to you either. She's just one more prize left behind when the old tribes fell. Don't get yourself killed over something you can't keep." The insult hung in the air, but the cowboy didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the leader, who sat tall in his saddle, his rifle resting across his lap. The two men measured each other in the firelight, knowing that one move would tip the balance and set off the storm. Behind them, the village stirred. A few of the settlers had come out, clutching rifles and shotguns, their faces pale but determined. They were tired of being pushed, tired of giving up pieces of their lives to men who took without asking. Yet fear held them back, keeping them in the shadows. Watching to see who would fire first, the rider at the cowboy's side leaned closer, his voice low. "We're outnumbered. If this turns to shooting, we won't hold them." The cowboy didn't answer. He knew it was true. Still, he could not step aside. The girl's words haunted him, digging deeper with every passing moment. "If I please you tonight, will you keep me forever?" Forever had never meant so much as it did now. With danger at their doorstep, the leader of the riders raised his rifle slightly, a silent signal. But before he could give the order, the girl stepped forward. She moved past the cowboy, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. The firelight caught her face, and for the first time, her voice rang out strong. "I am not a thing to be given or taken," she said. Her words carried across the circle of men, sharp and unyielding. The riders shifted uneasily, some sneering, others frowning. The leader smirked, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He had expected fear, not defiance. The cowboy reached for her arm, wanting to pull her back, but she did not move. She stood her ground as if she had drawn an invisible line in the dust. In that moment she seemed larger than life, her heritage burning in her veins, her spirit unbroken despite all that had been stripped away. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "You've got fire, girl. But fire burns out. Remember that." He lowered his rifle slightly, but the threat in his words was clear. "We'll be back. And next time it won't be talk." With that, he tugged the reins, his horse wheeling sharply. The riders circled once more, then turned and thundered back into the desert, their shouts fading into the night. Dust hung heavy in the air. Settling slowly as the village crept out of hiding, the cowboy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His revolver was still in his hand, but the weight of it suddenly felt heavy. The rider beside him lowered his rifle but kept his eyes on the horizon, suspicion etched deep in his face. The girl's knees buckled, but she caught herself before she fell. The cowboy stepped forward, steadying her. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening, not with fear but with the weight of what had just passed. "They'll come back," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But when they do, we'll be ready." Around them, the settlers began to murmur. Some muttered about moving on, leaving the village before it was swallowed by violence. Others spoke of standing together, building defenses, and facing what was coming. Divisions spread quickly, the weight of fear threatening to tear the fragile community apart. The rider who had joined them by the fire stepped closer, his voice cutting through the noise. "Those men won't stop. They've got power behind them, and they won't leave until they've taken everything they want. You folks can either stand as one or scatter and fall apart. That's the truth of it." The cowboy watched the faces around him, tired, hardened, fearful. He knew these people wanted peace, but peace was fragile on the frontier. It could be shattered by a single rifle shot or stolen away by men on horseback. He also knew the girl's presence had stirred something deeper, something that made the conflict about more than land or cattle. It was about survival, about the soul of the village itself. Later that night, when the crowd had thinned and the fire burned low, the girl sat near the embers, silent. The cowboy joined her, lowering himself to the ground. For a long time, neither spoke. The desert wind carried whispers through the trees, as though the land itself remembered what had happened. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why did you stand for me?" He thought for a moment, staring into the flames. "Because I've seen what happens when no one does." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of memory towns burned, families broken, promises shattered by greed and violence. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire. "They'll come back stronger. Then we'll find a way to be stronger still." The rider approached them quietly, his rifle slung across his back. "You've just made yourself the center of a storm," he said. His gaze flicked to the girl. "Both of you have." The cowboy met his eyes. "Then I guess we'd better be ready for it." The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant echo of hooves once more not close. Not yet, but enough to remind them that the night was far from over. The girl's hand tightened around the blanket draped across her shoulders, her eyes filled with questions that had no answers. The fire cracked, sparks flying upward into the dark sky. Suspense hung in the air, heavier than ever, as the village prepared for the storm they knew was coming. And deep inside, the cowboy wondered whether forever was something he could promise, so something fate would take away before he could even try. The days that followed were uneasy, each one heavy with the knowledge that the riders would return. The village seemed to breathe in whispers, every door shut tighter, every candle burned later into the night. People kept their guns close, though most had little faith in them. Fear spread quietly, yet so did a stubborn resolve. The land had shaped them into survivors, but survival on the frontier often came at a terrible cost. The cowboy stayed close to the girl. Though neither spoke much of the words she had asked by the fire, he couldn't answer her then, and he still couldn't now. But he found himself watching her, studying the way she moved through the settlement, how her presence unsettled some and inspired others. The children stared at her with wide eyes. Their mothers tugged them away, and the men whispered among themselves. Some saw her as a burden, a spark that had drawn danger. Others, though, saw her as a reason to finally stand their ground at night. The cowboy kept watch from the edge of the village. The desert stretched endless before him, quiet but never truly still. He listened for hoofbeats in the distance, for the cry of coyotes that sometimes carried like a warning. Each time the wind shifted, it carried the memory of the rider's promise. He had faced danger before, but this felt different. It wasn't just his own life at stake. Now it was hers, and perhaps the soul of the village itself. The rider who had arrived that night stayed, though no one asked him to. He carried himself like a man who had seen too many battles and trusted no one fully. He spoke little, yet his eyes missed nothing. He and the cowboy often stood side by side in silence, watching the horizon. Trust between them was fragile, but it was growing, forged not in words but in the knowledge that both would soon fight for the same thing. Tension built as small signs began to appear. A settler found hoof tracks near the river. Another swore he heard men's voices carried on the wind, speaking in the dark. Smoke rose from the distant hills one evening, curling into the sky like a warning. The villagers gathered in the square, restless and divided. Some begged to leave before it was too late. Others swore they would not be driven from the little they had built. Fear clashed with pride, and the cowboy felt the weight of their eyes turning toward him more and more. The girl sat apart, watching the arguments unfold. She knew she was at the heart of this storm. Every whisper, every raised voice, every clenched fist it all tied back to her. She had not asked to be placed in this place between two worlds, but here she was. Sometimes she caught fragments of her people's language in her dreams, words her mother had once sung to her by the fire. Other nights, she woke with the image of riders sweeping down, their faces lost to shadow. Each time she rose in the morning, she grew quieter. But her resolve hardened. The cowboy began training some of the men, teaching them how to handle their rifles with more care, how to fire steady and not waste a shot. The rider joined him, showing others how to move quietly in the dark, how to use the land itself as cover. It was rough work, and many of the settlers were clumsy, but desperation sharpened their efforts. They built makeshift barricades, reinforced doors, and dug shallow trenches at the edge of the village. Each hammer strike, each spade of earth, was filled with nervous urgency. The girl often came to watch. She didn't pick up a rifle, but her presence alone seemed to strengthen those who doubted themselves. Sometimes she spoke softly to the women, reminding them to keep water ready, to keep the children close. The cowboy noticed how the villagers' eyes began to change when they looked at her not just as a burden anymore, but as someone worth defending. Still, tension coiled tighter with each passing day. The horizon seemed to darken earlier, the nights stretched longer, and the desert air grew thick with waiting. The cowboy felt it most of all. Each sunrise brought the same question. Would this be the day the riders returned? He carried it like a stone in his chest, and though he never spoke of it, the girl seemed to know. She would sometimes catch his arm when he passed, her eyes searching his as though asking the same question she had whispered before. He never gave her an answer, but he never pulled away either. Then came the night when the wind shifted again. The moon hung low, pale and cold, and the land seemed to hold its breath. The dogs barked wildly, refusing to quiet even when their masters shouted. The cowboy was at his post on the edge of the village when he heard it, hoofbeats. Faint at first, then growing, steady as thunder rolling closer. His hand tightened on his revolver. This time, it wasn't a dream or a rumor. They were coming. He signaled to the rider, who lifted a lantern and swung it low, a silent warning. The village stirred. Men grabbed rifles, women pulled their children inside, and the square filled with whispers that rose into cries. The girl stepped out from one of the cabins, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her face pale but her eyes burning. She met his gaze across the distance, and though she said nothing, he felt her words pressing against him again. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the hard earth. Dust rose on the horizon, carrying with it the shadow of men on horseback. There were more this time, many more. Their voices carried before them, sharp and mocking. The sound of men who knew they were feared. The villagers gathered behind the barricades, clutching their weapons with shaking hands. The cowboy stood at the front, the rider just to his side. The girl remained close, though he wished she would stay back. Her presence steadied him, even as it made his heart heavier. The riders swept into view, their silhouettes framed by the moonlight. Dozens of them, maybe more. The leader rode at the front, the same man from before, his rifle raised high. He shouted something the wind carried across the land, a promise of destruction if they did not yield. His men whooped and hollered, circling the village like wolves around trapped prey. The cowboy lifted his revolver, not firing, but holding it steady, a silent signal that they would not run. The rider leveled his rifle. Around them, the villagers tried to hold firm, though fear rippled through the crowd like a crack in glass. The leader laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. "We warned you," he called out. "Now we'll take what's ours, and the rest of you can dig graves for what's left." The girl stepped forward, her voice carrying clear and strong. "I do not belong to you." The words silenced even some of the riders for a heartbeat. The sound of her defiance cutting sharper than any bullet. The cowboy felt his chest tighten. He knew the next moment could decide everything. The leader's smirk faltered, then twisted into rage. He raised his rifle higher, signaling his men. The riders began to press forward, their horses snorting and stamping, ready to break through. The village held its breath. The cowboy's finger rested on the trigger. The girl's hand brushed his sleeve again, her touch light but steady. The rider beside him exhaled slowly, his rifle steady. The air was thick with dust and fear. the ground trembling beneath the weight of the oncoming charge. The fire in the square roared higher as if feeding on the tension, casting wild shadows across every face. The riders shouted, their cries rising into the night. The villagers tightened their grips on their weapons. And just as the first of the horses surged forward, the cowboy's voice rang out, not loud, but steady enough to be heard by all. Then let it begin. The world seemed to hold still in that instant, caught on the edge of violence. With forever hanging in the balance, the night cracked open like a rifle shot. And in the next breath, chaos swept across the village. Horses charged, dust exploded upward, and men shouted over the thunder of hooves. The cowboy fired first, his revolver blazing in the firelight. The rider at his side let off a shot that dropped one of the attackers clean from his saddle. The villagers, trembling but determined, pulled their triggers too. Gunfire rattled through the dark, echoing against the wooden cabins and fences. Turning the quiet settlement into a battlefield, the riders pressed hard, their horses breaking against the crude barricades. Some leaped down, swinging rifles like clubs, while others tried to circle around the edges. The cowboy fought through it all, his body moving on instinct, every muscle remembering a life carved from survival. Each time his revolver fired, he thought of the girl behind him, her face lit by firelight, her words still alive in his chest. She stayed close at first, huddled behind the wagons set across the street, watching the fight unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. But when one of the attackers broke through, lunging toward a settler's wife and child, she didn't hide. She grabbed a fallen board and struck the man across the back with every ounce of strength she had. The settler pulled his family to safety, and though her hands shook, she did not run. The cowboy saw it, even in the madness, and pride swelled in him. She wasn't just waiting to be saved. She was standing with them, as much a part of this place as any man holding a rifle. The battle raged on. A blur of gun smoke, shouts, and the flash of firelight. The rider beside the cowboy fought like a man who had been waiting for this moment his whole life. His rifle never missed, his movements sharp and certain. For all his rough edges, he was unshakable when it mattered most. Hours felt like minutes. By the time the dust settled, the riders were scattering back into the night. Some lay still on the ground, others clutched wounds as they fled. The leader, once so sure of himself, had been thrown from his horse during the chaos. He staggered away, blood on his face, his promises of victory now hollow echoes in the dark. His men left him behind, their cries fading into the desert wind. Silence fell heavy over the village, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the groans of the wounded. Slowly, the settlers emerged from hiding, their eyes wide with disbelief. Against all odds, they were still standing. The barricades were broken, some cabins scarred by bullets, but the heart of the village had not been taken. The cowboy lowered his revolver, the weight of it suddenly heavy in his hand. His chest heaved with exhaustion, his body aching from the fight. He looked around at the faces of those who had survived, then to the girl who stood not far from him. Her hair tangled, her dress torn, but her spirit unbroken. Their eyes met, and for the first time. The silence between them felt like an answer. The rider leaned on his rifle, his breath ragged but steady. "They'll think twice before coming back," he muttered. "If they come at all," the settlers gathered, voices rising in relief and sorrow alike. Some wept over the fallen, others clung to their families. But through it all, a new strength took root. They had not run. They had not surrendered. They had stood together, and the land itself seemed to recognize it. The girl walked toward the cowboy, her steps slow but certain. She stopped before him, her eyes searching his face. "You didn't leave me," she said quietly. He shook his head, too tired for many words. Couldn't? Her lips trembled. Not with fear this time, but with the weight of what they had endured. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against the scars on his knuckles. "Forever is a long time," she whispered. Echoing the words he had spoken before, he looked at her. The firelight soft against her face, and for once he didn't hesitate. "Then we'll take it one day at a time," he said. It wasn't a promise of fairy tales, but it was real. And in the dust of the frontier, that was worth more than forever. The villagers began to mend what had been broken. They buried their dead, patched their homes, and strengthened their fences. But something deeper had been built that night, something that no hammer or rifle could create: trust, unity, the understanding that they could not survive alone. But together, they had a chance. The rider stayed a while longer. Though he was restless, his eyes always drawn to the horizon. He helped rebuild, offered quiet advice, but everyone knew he would not remain forever. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, he saddled his horse. The cowboy met him at the edge of the village. "You fought like hell," the cowboy said simply. The rider gave a faint smile. "So did you. She's safe now, as safe as she can be in a world like this. Keep her that way." He tipped his hat and rode off into the desert. A lone figure swallowed by the rising light. Life slowly returned to the village. The children played again, though their laughter carried a sharper edge, born of what they had seen. The women tended to the wounded, their hands steady, their eyes tired but proud. The men worked harder than ever, no longer for themselves alone, but for each other. The girl found her place among them. She helped with the chores, cared for the children, and walked the land as if reclaiming a piece of it for herself. Some still looked at her with uncertainty, but more and more they looked at her with respect. She had stood firm when it mattered most, and that was something the frontier never forgot. The cowboy stayed by her side. Though he spoke little of the bond that had grown between them, he didn't need to. It showed in the way his eyes softened when she laughed, in the way he watched over her without smothering her freedom, in the way he carried himself with more purpose than he had in years. At night, they often sat by the fire, the same fire where her question had first been spoken. The stars stretched endless above them, the desert wind whispering through the trees. Sometimes she would lean against him, quiet and thoughtful, and sometimes he would take her hand without a word. Forever was still uncertain, but for the first time in his life, tomorrow felt like enough. The land did not grow easier. The late 1800s were hard on every soul who tried to carve a life out of dust and stone, but the village endured, and so did they. The story of that night when riders swept in like a storm, and the people refused to break, was told again and again, passed down like a promise. A promise that no matter how dark the world became, there would always be those willing to stand. And for the girl who had once whispered her plea beneath the stars, forever no longer felt like a question. It felt like something she was already living, one day at a time. With the man who had chosen to stand with her when it mattered most, the fire crackled softly. The village quiet in the distance, and the desert stretched wide and unyielding around them. Somewhere out there, shadows still rode, but for now, they were only echoes. Here, in this small place carved from hardship, hope had taken root. And though the future was uncertain, the bond they had forged was strong enough to face whatever storms might come.